This is the third recording for section 8.2. And so the last bit will be a little bit about state income tax and Social Security and Medicare, which we, in addition to income tax, we are required to pay the federal government FICA, which is Federal Insurance Contribution Act taxes, so we call them FICA taxes, that are used for Social Security and Medicare benefits. Social Security provides payments to eligible retirees, people with health problems, eligible dependents of deceased persons, and disabled citizens. Medicare provides health care coverage mostly to Americans 65 and older, paid on wages only. So the rates in 2012 are listed here. You could certainly Google search and look for the Social Security and Medicare rates for 2016. So again, depending on how much money is made, the employee pays 5.65% in FICA taxes on the first $110,000 of income, and then 1.45% in income of excess of $110,000. You can see that the employer must also pay Social Security and Medicare, and it matches, but pays in 2012 paid 7.65% on the first $110,000 paid in wages, and the same 1.45% in excess of $110,000. And then there's also the self-employed rates, right, which are based on net profits, right? So that is gross profit minus all the expenses, right, are your net profits. So pays a very high tax rate, but on the net profits in excess for the first $110,000, and 2.9% of the net profits in excess of $110,000. So computing FICA tax. If you are not self-employed and earn $150,000, what are your FICA taxes? And again, we will have to, I can't go back, so I'll just have to put it back, write it here. For the employee, we're not self-employed, so the first column is employee rates, and that was 5.6% on the first $110,000. And 1.45% for any income above $110,000. So we're not asked about the employer's contribution. We're talking about the employee. So this person earns $150,000. So they pay 5.65% on the first $110,000, and 5.65% is 0.0565. All right, we just change it to a decimal by dividing by 100 or moving it 2 places to the right. So 5.65% on the first 110,000. And then 1.45%, which is then of course 0.0145 on the amount after 110,000, which the total, right, this person earns $150,000. So what's left over to pay in what's left over in excess of 110,000 is 40,000. And again, just like in the previous, right, these two should total the amount, which they do. All right, so then you just punch that in a calculator. 0.0565 times 110,000 plus 0.0145 times 40,000. So the FICA taxes are $67.95. But this person has a very high income, right? A pay stub attached to your paycheck provides a lot of information about the money you earned, including both your gross pay and your net pay. Your gross pay is your base pay. You know, when people say they make $40,000 a year, that's the gross pay, right? Before all the taxes and everything are taken out. So the gross pay is the salary prior to any withheld taxes for the pay period the check covers. And the net pay is the actual amount of your check after taxes, right? Federal taxes, if there's a state income tax, the FICA taxes, all right, all that's taken out, that is your net pay. Here is a portion of the state income tax table. This is actually for 2016. Note that Illinois is one of the handful of states with a flat income tax rate. This is just a portion of the states, but you can see that they only have one income bracket, and the state income tax is 3.75%, whereas some, such as Iowa, has 9 different brackets, right, from 0.35% all the way up to 8.98%, depending on how much is earned. All right, but you can see Illinois and Indiana, Massachusetts, Michigan, right, they have a flat income tax, and some states don't have any income tax, state income tax. Alaska, Florida, I know I used to live in Washington State did not have an income tax either. You would like to have some extra spending money, so you decide to work a part-time job at the local gym. The job pays $10 per hour and you work $20 per week. Your employer withholds 10% of your gross pay for federal taxes, 5.65% for FICA taxes, and 3% for state taxes. Part A, what is your weekly gross pay? So that's the pay minus the pay before taxes are taken out. So you earn $10 per hour and you work 20 hours per week. So your gross pay is $200. All right, but unfortunately you're not getting that $200 because the taxes are taken out. How much is withheld per week for federal taxes? Well, your employer withholds 10% of for federal taxes. So 10% of your $200, so that's 0.10 times 200, which is of course $20 a week for federal taxes. And we'll have to look back at this. You have writing it in your notes, but you'll have to look back at it because I can't scroll back. How much is withheld per week for FICA taxes? And let's look back at that. It said 5.65% of your gross income, which is $200. So again, we change that to a decimal, 0.0565 times 200. Anytime we want a percent of something, we multiply. 0.0565 times 200 should be $11.30. Part D, how much is withheld per week for state taxes? Well, it told us that the state rate was 3%, so we want 3% of the $200, which again, 3% is 0.03 times 200, which should give you $6 for state taxes. All right, state taxes are a lot less than federal taxes. What is your weekly net pay? So it's your gross pay, all right, minus your taxes. The gross pay was $200, but then we had to subtract off the taxes, and we had $20 for federal. You can put a plus sign there because I put the parentheses, so there I'm going to add them all up and then subtract from 200. The federal was 200. The FICA was $11.30, and the state taxes were $6. So 20 plus $11.30 plus 6. So we're going to subtract off $37.30. If you punch that in a calculator, you'll get $162.70. So although you think to yourself you're making $200, you're actually bringing home $162.70. All right, so you always have to take that into consideration when you think about spending money on a car and that type of thing, right? Is that you always need to look at your net pay, not your gross pay. And the last question here says, what percentage of your gross pay is withheld for taxes, round to the nearest 1/10%? So what percentage of your gross pay, so your percentage means parts out of the whole. Well, the gross pay is $200, and the taxes, the total taxes over the total pay is how you will get the percent. In a sense, you want to know what percent of the 200 is the taxes. All right. What percentage of your gross pay, which is 200, is withheld for taxes? So in a sense, you're doing what percent of 200 is $37.30. So if you have a hard time thinking about setting up this proportion over here, you know, go back to your sentence. You know, for any basic percent problem, you can set it up as what percent of what is what. So we want to know what percent of, which is times, the 200 is, which is equals, remember of is times, is equals 3730. All right, and then to solve, we divide by 200, all right, which is exactly what we have over here. 3730 divided by 200. Which is 0.1865 or 18.65%. Which of course we could have, since we were always taking a percent of the gross, that was sort of the more complicated way of doing it, but it was good because we got to remind ourselves about our basic percent problem, so I like that. But since we were taking a percent always of 200, we could have actually added those percentages together. The 3% for the state income tax, the 5.6% for FICA, and the 10% for federal income tax. And we would have had 18.65%. Only because we're always taking a percent of that 200. All right, that is the end of section 8.2.